Everyone told the young king he was about to ruin himself. His father's widow wept in front of the whole court. The great families whispered behind their gloves. And in a single gray afternoon, half the kingdom of Wrenholt decided that their new ruler was a cold and heartless boy. But when King Callan Thornevale set his seal upon the order that emptied Hawthorne Hall of the most powerful family in the land, his hand did not shake. Because 3 nights earlier, by the light of a single candle, he had opened an old leather ledger that no one was ever meant to place in his hands, and he had read something there that a man cannot read and then walk away from. Stay with this story until the end, because nothing is what it seems at the start, and the truth waiting inside those pages is worse than anyone in that grand old house ever imagined. Callan was 26 years old the morning they buried his father. The rain came down in a thin, endless drizzle over the hills of Wrenholt, and the whole court stood in black around the family tomb, while the bells of Ashmere, the capital, rang slow and heavy across the valley. King Aldous Thornevale had ruled for 31 years, and the people had loved him in the quiet way that people love a thing they expect to always be there. Now he was gone, and his only living son stood at the front of the crowd with rain running down his collar, and no idea in the world how to be a king. Callan had not always lived far from his father. Once long ago, when his mother, Queen Mara, was still alive, Hawthorne Hall had been a warm place full of laughter. Mara had died of a fever when Callan was only 9, and for years after that it had been just the boy and his father, 2 quiet men rattling around a house too big for them. Then 8 years ago, King Aldous had married again. Her name was Lady Rosalind, and she was gentle and beautiful and much younger than the king. Callan had not hated her. He had even in a careful way been glad his father was less alone. But Rosalind had not come to Hawthorne Hall by herself. She had brought her family. The Vance family arrived like a slow tide. First it was only Rosalind's elder brother, Lord Edmund Vance, come to see his sister settled. Then it was Edmund's wife, the sharp-eyed Lady Petra, then their grown son Cashan and their daughter Delphine, and then cousins and uncles and hangers-on that no one could quite name. What had started as a visit became a season, and a season became a way of life. By the time old King Aldous fell ill, the Vances did not live at Hawthorne Hall so much as rule it. They took the best rooms. They rode the best horses. They dined at the high table every night while the king coughed in his sickbed upstairs. And Callan, who had gone away 3 years before to govern the northern provinces in his father's name, had come home for the funeral to find his childhood house full of strangers who looked at him as though he were the guest. On the evening after the burial, when a grieving family should have sat quietly together, Callan came down the great staircase and heard music. He stopped on the landing, his hand on the cold stone rail, and listened. There were fiddles playing in the long hall. There was laughter. There was the clink of goblets and the smell of roasted meat drifting up the stairs. His father had been in the ground for less than a day, and the Vance family was throwing a feast. He walked into the long hall, and the noise did not stop. Lord Edmund sat at the very head of the table, his father's chair, Callan noted, the one carved with the Thornevale oak, with a cup in his hand and his face red with wine. Cashan and Delphine were dancing near the fire. Lady Petra was directing the servants with a flick of her fingers. And there, at the far end, sat Rosalind in her black mourning gown, pale and still, staring at nothing while her family celebrated around her. "Callan," Edmund called out, spreading his arms wide as though the young king were a favorite nephew arriving late. "Come, sit, drink. We are remembering your dear father in the way he would have wanted." Callan looked at the table, at the wasted food, at the drunken cousins. "My father is not yet cold," he said quietly. The room did not go silent. That was the thing he would remember later, that his words landed and simply did not matter. Edmund laughed as though Callan had made a joke. "Grief is a heavy thing, boy. Best not to drown in it. Sit, sit." Callan did not sit. He turned and walked out, and behind him the fiddles struck up again. That night he could not sleep. He wandered the halls of the house he had grown up in, and everywhere he went he found small wrongnesses that nagged at him like a stone in a boot. The portraits of his mother's family had been taken down from the west corridor and replaced with paintings he did not recognize, the Vances, he realized, commissioned in oils and hung where Thornevale's used to be. The library, his father's most beloved room, had been half emptied. The fine old books sold off, someone said, to a dealer in the city. The servants he passed kept their eyes down and moved quickly, and when he tried to speak kindly to a young maid carrying linens, she flinched as though she expected a blow. Her name, he learned, was Nell. She could not have been more than 17. When Callan asked her gently how long she had worked in the house, she told him 3 years, and when he asked how the household treated her, she went white and said only, "Well enough, your grace," and hurried away. But he had seen the bruise on her wrist, half hidden by her sleeve in the shape of a hard-gripping hand. It was the old steward who finally spoke plainly to him. Master Harlan Croft had served Hawthorne Hall for 40 years. He had taught Callan to ride when the boy was small, had slipped him honey cakes from the kitchen, had stood at the back of every important day of his life. Now Harlan was old and stooped, and there was a fear in his eyes that Callan had never seen there before. Harlan found him near midnight in the cold library, standing among the empty shelves. The old man closed the door softly behind him and stood for a long moment, as though gathering the last of his courage. "You have noticed things, your grace," Harlan said. "I have watched you these 2 days. You have your father's eyes, you see." "I see a house I do not recognize," Callan said. "I see my father's chair filled by another man before the grave is settled. I see servants afraid. Tell me plainly, Harlan, what has happened here while I was in the north." The old steward's hands were trembling. "I am an old man," he said. "I have kept quiet because a quiet servant keeps his place and a servant with no place starves, but I cannot carry it any longer, not now that you are home." He reached inside his coat and drew out something wrapped in cloth, a book, thick and worn, bound in cracked brown leather. "Your father kept the true accounts of this estate in his own hand for 30 years. When he fell ill, the keeping of the accounts was taken from me and given to Lord Edmund's men. But your father in his last clear months asked me to keep a second book, a shadow book. The real one, he knew, I think, at the end that something was wrong. He did not live long enough to act on it." Callan took the ledger. It was heavier than it looked. "Read it when you are alone, your grace," Harlan said. "Read it all, and then decide what kind of king you mean to be." The old man bowed low and slipped out of the room, and his footsteps faded down the corridor. Callan carried the ledger up to his chamber, bolted the door, and set it on the desk beside a single burning candle. For a long moment he simply looked at it, this plain and ugly book, and something in him warned that once he opened it, he could never close it again. Outside his window, the last of the Vances' feast was breaking up, drunken voices calling out across the courtyard. He thought of his father coughing alone upstairs while the house he built was picked apart below him. Then he opened the ledger to the first page, and he began to read. The candle burned low, and as line after line of neat, damning figures marched down the page in the old steward's careful hand, the young king's face went from grief to confusion to a cold and rising horror, because what he was reading was not carelessness and it was not waste. It was a crime, and it had a name written all through it. By the time the candle had burned down to a stub of wax, Callan understood everything, and he almost wished he did not. The shadow ledger told a story in numbers, and it was an ugly one. For 8 years, since the Vance family had first come to Hawthorne Hall, the wealth of the Crown estate had been bleeding away drop by drop. At first it was small, a horse bought that never arrived in the stables, a shipment of wine paid for twice, a set of accounts rounded up here and there. But as old King Aldous grew sicker and paid less attention, the theft had grown bolder and hungrier. Whole tenant farms had been taxed at twice the lawful rate, and the extra silver had never reached the Crown's coffers. It had vanished into private purses. The wages of the household servants had been quietly cut again, then in some cases simply stopped, while the family that lived off their labor dressed in silk and ate off gold. The library's books had been sold and the money pocketed. Timber had been cut from the royal woods and shipped south without record. And through all of it ran one name again and again in Harlan's patient hand, authorized by Lord Edmund Vance. Authorized by Lord Edmund Vance. Approved and sealed Lord Edmund Vance. But the worst of it came near the end of the book, and when Callan reached it, his hands went still on the page. In the last 2 years of his father's life, dozens of documents had been signed with the king's own royal seal, grants of land, transfers of money, letters of authority, on dates when Callan knew his father had been far too ill to hold a pen. He remembered the reports that had reached him in the north. The king can no longer sign his name, the king's hand shakes too badly, the king sleeps most of the day. And yet here were his father's seal and signature, sharp and firm, on paper after paper, every one of them moving wealth or power toward the Vance family. Someone had been forging the King of Wrenholt's own name, and there was only one family that stood to gain from every single stroke of that stolen pen. Callan sat back in his chair as the gray light of dawn crept into the room. He was young, and he was grieving, and he was alone in a house full of people who would happily see him fail. But he was also now the king, and a cold, clear certainty settled over him like a cloak. He would not pretend he had not seen this. He would not let it stand. He moved carefully at first, the way a hunter moves. He did not want the Vances to know he suspected anything until he was ready. Over the next several days, he went quietly to the one man in the household he believed he could trust, Chancellor Osric, a thin, cautious old scholar who had served his father honestly and had been pushed further and further from power as the Vances rose. Callan brought him the ledger in secret, in the gray hour before the house woke, and watched the Chancellor's face turn ashen as he read. "I suspected," Osric whispered. "Heaven forgive me, your grace, I suspected for years, but I had no proof and no power, and every man who spoke against them lost his post or worse. There was a groom who complained of the accounts, he was dismissed, and no one saw him again. A clerk who asked questions was branded a thief and driven out. They rule this house by fear, your grace. And now, I fear, they mean to rule it by law. There is talk that Lord Edmund is drawing up papers to have himself named guardian and steward of Hawthorne Hall in perpetuity, to bind the estate to his family forever, whatever you may wish." "Then we must be quicker than his papers," Callan said. Together, over long secret nights, they gathered what they needed. Osric knew where the true records were kept and how to compare the forged signatures against the real ones. Master Harlan brought out more hidden documents. Even young Nell, once she understood the king meant the family no love, found her courage and told him things, how she had once been ordered to carry sealed letters up to the sick king's chamber and then carry them straight back down unopened to Lord Edmund, letters that never reached the old man at all. That last detail lodged in Callan's mind like a splinter, though he did not yet understand its full weight. He set it aside for later. First, there was a reckoning to be had. The Vances, for their part, were not blind. A cleverness runs in greedy families, and Lady Petra in particular had a nose for danger. She noticed the young king's quiet coming and going. She noticed that Chancellor Osric, so long ignored, was suddenly at the king's side, and she warned her husband. So it was that Edmund decided to charm the boy before the boy could move against him, and he arranged a grand family dinner, all warmth and welcome, to remind the young king exactly how outnumbered he was. The dinner was a strange and tense affair. The whole Vance family gathered at the long table, all smiles and honeyed words. Edmund toasted the young king's health and spoke of the great and glorious future they would build together. Cashan flattered him about his governance of the north. Delphine laughed prettily at everything he said. Lady Petra pressed the finest dishes upon him. And through it all, Callan sat quiet and watchful, saying little, letting them believe he was a nervous boy overwhelmed by his new crown. Only Rosalind, his stepmother, seemed not to be playing a part. She sat pale and silent at the table, picking at her food, and once or twice Callan caught her looking at him with an expression he could not read, something like worry, something like warning. She loved my father, he thought suddenly, watching her. Whatever else is true in this house, that much is real. It made what he had to do no easier. Near the end of the meal, Edmund leaned toward him, his voice low and warm and full of poison. "You know, Callan, a king so young needs steady hands around him, men he can trust, family. Leave the tiresome business of accounts and estates to those who understand it, and you may enjoy your crown in peace. We are your family now. Let us carry the weight for you." And there it was, the whole trap laid out in a single friendly sentence. Callan looked into the older man's red, confident face, and he made his decision, fully and finally, in that moment. "You are right, my lord," he said quietly. "A king must have people he can trust around him." He set down his cup. "That is exactly why I have made a decision, and I will share it with you all now, since the family is gathered." The table quieted. Something in his tone had changed. "By the authority of the crown," Callan said, and his voice carried clear down the length of the hall, "the entire Vance family is to leave Hawthorne Hall. You will remove yourselves and your belongings from this estate within 3 days. Every room will be returned to the crown. Every account will be surrendered to the Chancellor for examination. This house belonged to my mother's family for 400 years, and it will not remain a private purse for yours." For a heartbeat there was total silence, then the hall erupted. Edmund shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward, his face gone from red to purple. "You insolent boy," he roared. "You have no idea what you are doing. This family made your father's reign possible. We held this estate together while he wasted away." "You bled it dry while he wasted away," Callan said. Cashan was shouting. Delphine was in tears. Lady Petra had gone very white and very still, which was more frightening than any shouting. And Rosalind had risen slowly to her feet, one hand pressed to her mouth, staring at her stepson with an expression of pure shock. "Callan," she said, her voice breaking, "you would throw me out, me, your father's wife, into the cold with nothing before he is a month in his grave." It was the one blow he had not prepared for, and it struck home, but he held his ground. "I am removing your family from this estate, my lady," he said more gently. "What becomes of you we will speak of alone." "There is nothing to speak of if you shame me before the whole court," she cried, and she fled the hall in tears, and the sight of her going was a knife in him. Edmund watched her go, and then he turned back to Callan, and now his fury had cooled into something far more dangerous, a slow, ugly smile. "You think this is over," he said softly. "You think you can simply wave your hand and be rid of us. You are a child playing at being a king." He leaned across the table. "You should be careful, Callan, careful what old papers you go digging up, because I know things about this family and about your beloved father that would break your heart and shame your name across every kingdom in the world. Push me out that door, and I will make certain everyone learns them. Sign your little order, see what it costs you." And with that, Lord Edmund Vance swept out of the hall, his family trailing behind him, leaving the young king standing alone at the head of a table full of ruined food and guttering candles, knowing, with a cold drop in his stomach, that the fight had only just begun. Lord Edmund did not go quietly, and he did not go at all, not at first. When the 3 days passed and the Crown's guards came to Hawthorne Hall to see the family removed, they found the great doors barred and the Vances entrenched inside like a garrison under siege. Edmund had spent those 3 days not packing but plotting. He had sent riders out across Wrenholt carrying letters, and the letters told a story, his story. A cruel and jealous young king, they said, drunk on his new power, was casting his own grieving stepmother out into the winter with nothing but the clothes on her back. A poor widow, still weeping for her husband, thrown into the road by a heartless boy. It was a lie shaped from just enough truth to cut deep, and it spread through the taverns and market squares faster than Callan could have believed. Within a week, the mood of the kingdom had turned. Crowds gathered outside the palace at Ashmere. Ballads were sung in the streets about the wronged Lady Rosalind. Some of the great noble houses, who had never liked the idea of a king so young, began to murmur that perhaps the boy was not fit to rule, that perhaps a council of steady older lords ought to guide his hand, and everyone knew whose hand would truly hold the reins if such a council were formed. Edmund had turned his own crime into a weapon and pointed it straight back at the king. Callan's own counsel wavered. Even loyal Chancellor Osric came to him grim-faced. "The people believe him, your grace," he said. "We have the ledger, we have the forged papers, but the common folk cannot read a ledger, and a ledger cannot compete with a weeping widow in a ballad. If you cannot show the kingdom plainly and simply why you did this, then Lord Edmund will win. Not in this house, in every heart in Wrenholt. And a king the people have turned against does not keep his crown for long." For the first time since he had opened the shadow ledger, Callan felt the ground move under him. He had proof of the theft, yes. But theft was a dry and complicated thing, and the Vances had spun a tale of cruelty that was simple and warm and easy to feel. He needed something more. He needed the truth, the whole truth, and something in him remembered the splinter he had set aside days ago. Letters carried up to the sick king's chamber, and carried straight back down, unopened. He sent for Nell. The girl was frightened to be summoned, but Callan spoke to her gently, and slowly the story came out. During the last year of the old king's life, she said, she and the other servants had been forbidden to carry anything to the king's chamber without Lord Edmund's leave. Letters had come to the house addressed to the king in his own son's hand from the north, sealed with Callan's own mark, and every one of them had been taken by Lord Edmund and never delivered, and letters had gone the other way, too. The old king, weak and lonely and believing his son had abandoned him, had writ to Callan again and again in his shaking hand, begging him to come home, asking why the boy never answered. Those letters, Nell said, had been burned in the study fire on Lord Edmund's orders, all but the last few. Those, she believed, were still hidden somewhere in Edmund's private rooms. The man was too careful to keep a thing he might one day use, and too greedy to burn a thing that might be worth something. Callan sat very still as the full and terrible shape of it came clear to him at last. For 3 years he had believed his father had grown cold and distant, that the old king had turned his love toward his new wife's family and forgotten his own son. He had stayed away in the north out of a wounded, silent pride, thinking himself unwanted. And all that time his father had been writing to him, begging him to come home, and Edmund Vance had stood between them, burning the letters, so that father and son would die as strangers, and the Vances could rule the dying king unopposed. Edmund had not only robbed the crown. He had stolen from Callan the last years he might have had with his father. He had stolen a reconciliation. He had made two men who loved each other believe they were forsaken. And there was one more person, Callan realized, who deserved to know this even more than he did. He went to find Rosalind. His stepmother had not fled the estate. She had shut herself in her chambers, refusing to see anyone, caught between the family she was born to and the stepson she did not truly wish to hate. When Callan came to her at last, she was cold and wary, her eyes red from weeping. "Have you come to gloat?" she asked. "To watch me pack?" "I have come to tell you the truth," he said, "about your brother and about my father and about you." And he told her everything. He told her of the stolen wages and the forged seal and the emptied library. And then, watching her face, he told her about the letters, how Edmund had kept a dying man from his son, how the old king had begged for Callan to come home and had died believing himself abandoned, also that the Vance family could keep their grip on him to the very end. He watched the truth land on her like a physical blow. Rosalind had loved Aldous, that had always been real. And now she understood that her own brother had spent her husband's last years poisoning his heart, feeding him a lie of loneliness so that he might die easier to control. She sat down slowly, as though her legs would not hold her, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she rose and her face had changed. The grief was still there, but under it now was something hard and clear. "Come with me," she said. She led him not to the hall or the courtyard where the guards and the Vances were locked in their standoff, but up a narrow back stair to Edmund's private study. She had a key, of course she had a key. She was his sister, and she opened a locked cabinet in the wall, and from the back of it she drew a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. She had not known what they were. She knew now. She placed them in Callan's hands. They were the last letters, his father's hand, weak and wandering across the page, but unmistakably his. Callan read the top one there in the cold study while his stepmother stood beside him, and the words undid 3 years of silent hurt in a single moment. His father had not forgotten him. His father had wanted him home. His father had loved him to the very end. What followed was quick, once the truth had a face and a voice. Rosalind did not hide behind her brother, and she did not let him hide behind her. When Callan brought his case before the assembled council of Wrenholt, the ledger, the forged papers, and now the burned and stolen letters, it was Rosalind herself, the wronged widow of Edmund's own ballads, who stood before the lords of the realm and spoke against her brother. She told them plainly what he had done, how he had robbed the crown, how he had forged her husband's name, and how he had kept a dying king from his only son. Coming from the young king, it might have sounded like the excuse of a boy who wanted an old family gone. Coming from Rosalind in her black mourning gown, with tears in her eyes and steel in her voice, it could not be doubted. The ballads died in a single afternoon. The crowds that had gathered against Callan melted away, and the mood of the kingdom turned once more, this time against the man who had lied to them. Lord Edmund Vance was stripped of his stolen titles and his stolen wealth. Every coin of it counted out from the shadow ledger and reclaimed for the crown and returned, where it could be, to the servants and the tenant farmers he had robbed. He and his branch of the family, Petra, Cashin, Delphine, and the whole train of hangers-on were removed from Hawthorne Hall and from every estate of the crown, forbidden ever to return. The forgery of a king's seal was a grave crime, and Edmund faced the full weight of the law for it. He ended his days a disgraced and landless man, his cleverness worth nothing at last. But Callan in the end did not throw his stepmother into the cold, as the ballads had accused him of doing. When the great house was emptied of the Vances and quiet returned to Hawthorne Hall, he went to Rosalind and told her that she was welcome to remain, not as a resident of a private purse, but as his father's widow, and if she wished it, as something like family. She thanked him. But she chose, in the end, to go not driven out, but leaving of her own will, to live quietly in a small house by the sea that had been her own before ever she married a king. "You do not need the shadow of my family over you," she told him at the gate. "You will be a good king, Callan. Your father knew it. So do I," and she went with her head high, and Callan watched her go with a strange ache that was not quite grief and not quite peace. The kingdom understood, in time, that the young king had not acted out of cruelty, but out of justice, and the people came to trust him for it. for they saw that here was a man who would not look away from a hard truth even when it cost him, and who would stand by what was right even when the whole world sang against him. When it was all over, Callan sat alone in his father's study, his study now, with the last of the recovered letters open before him. Outside, the first snow of winter was falling soft over the hills of Wrenholt, over the tomb where his father lay. He read the final letter one more time, the one his father had written only days before the end, the one that never reached him. And at the very bottom, in a hand so weak it was barely there, his father had written a single line, and it was the reason Callan would carry that letter close to his heart for the rest of his life. "Whatever they tell you, my son, and whatever you come to believe of me in my silence, know that I—" The letter ended there. The old king's strength had failed him, and the sentence was never finished. And Callan, king of Wrenholt, folded the paper with great care, and finished it himself in the quiet of his own heart, in the only way it could ever have ended.